Welcome everybody to another edition of TRG Talks Digital. Today I have with me Robin Copley, who's an independent financial planner. Hello, Robin.
Hi there, Rick, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Lovely to have you on the show. Now, independent financial planner. Ooh, isn't that like just another word for an independent financial advisor? You're one of them sharks, aren't you?
I think it's very easy to think that way, and rightfully so, actually. I think there's a lot of people within this market who go by different monikers, and essentially they are insurance people dressed up as different things. But the key differential is still in the name, it's the planner. So I'm not focused on selling products. I'm not commission driven. I'm not a salesman. Instead, I'm a professional planner. What I do is I work with people to help form that plan so that they can one day make work optional or leave a legacy which really matters and is in line with their values. It's not about the investments. It's not about the insurance. Those are tools as to how we get there, but that's a secondary conversation. What we focus on is the individual, their life, what matters to them. It's a very different setup.
Okay, so there's a subtle difference then between the financial advisor and the financial planner.
Yeah, I think so. And perhaps this is something which has developed over time with maybe the more new breed of financial professionals. My background is from the UK, and I entered the profession in 2013, so just as the retail distribution review was coming in. And what that did was it outlawed, in many senses, a lot of the commission-driven behaviours and the commission-driven products. So I've never really operated in a world whereby it was commission-led and commission-first. For me, what this does is it means that everything has to be around fiduciary duty, so it has to be around putting the clients first. And so this language play, which came in around what do we really call ourselves to differentiate ourselves from the old, that's been something that the industry has somewhat wrestled with. Here in the international space, it is still, as with much of the world, outside of the much more developed markets such as the US and the UK, it is still much more product-driven, much more commission-driven. I think I am technically the only fiduciary financial planner in Vietnam. And that's something which I have to achieve by using contracts to do that, rather than it being enshrined in Vietnamese law. I have to contractually make myself a fiduciary here, because the market isn't developed enough to do that. But it's a really important differentiation. It's a really, really, really clear and important thing to have, which, in my opinion, shouldn't be the case. It shouldn't be needed. And yet, it's something that we have to do out here.
But that was an evolution even in the UK, right?
It was, that's correct. Yeah, exactly. So the UK still has a section of the market, and for that matter, a large section of the population, which are burdened by products which were more for the benefit of the person that they were speaking to, the advisor, than actually the benefit of the client. I've seen products stacked within each other, which all pay commission or paid commission to the advisor who's taken that money and gone over the hill. For me, operating on a fee-only basis and on a contractually fiduciary basis, it's a completely different proposition, a completely different model. For me, I have to act within the client's best interest, and the fees have to be transparent. But really, it's about something which is more fundamental. As I mentioned before, we're not focusing on the product. The product is a secondary consideration. Really, what we're focusing on is the client, on you, for example. What are your wants? What are your hopes? What are your dreams? What are your fears? And then how do we build a plan to make sure that we're covered if it all goes wrong, and we're covered if it all goes right? How do we turn those things into a reality, rather than what's going to give you the best return or what's going to be the best insurance product for this? Those are tools, but they come after. And what matters is the client and the client's family. That's what has to come first.
So this distinction between financial planners and financial advisors, so that's commonplace now in the UK, is it?
I think it is much more commonplace in the UK. There's still some confusion around language, and it's an eternal debate on things like LinkedIn, for example. But the planner badge, as it were, I think is becoming more and more clear as to what that job actually is. as opposed to being a broker, a product salesperson. Many planners will be able to fulfill both functions. I'm an example of being able to fulfill both functions. So I'll do the planning. When it comes to recommending a product and implementing that product, I can do that too. And that's kind of on the broker side, the implementing. But really, it has to be planning that is core and center of the profession, and it has to be that moving forward. Especially with an increase in things like there's the information that's available to people, and quite rightly that's being made more and more available. And for that matter, fantastic tools such as AI, how that comes into it. This is dramatically changing, what the profession can be, not just what it should be. And fortunately, I and many others are, especially within the UK, are at the forefront of what it should be, as in really fundamentally about the client, rather than about the product, rather than about the this investment return maybe 1% higher, in which case that's great. But if it's not providing something which has real value to the client, then it's kind of meaningless.
In the UK, is there therefore a shift of people, they're changing into financial planners?
Yes, yeah, massively so. So we've seen a transition. A lot of that took place immediately after the retail distribution review. And one of the clearest things with that was the move between what could be kindly referred to as retail share classes into what was called clean share classes. Now, what this means in kind of simple human terms is that when you invest into a fund, old school, that would pay a commission to a financial advisor. Right? In the UK now, those retail share classes, they're not a thing. They're not allowed to be sold in the same way. And so instead, everybody's on the clean share class, which makes it much more cost effective for the end client. But what it means is that fees can't be hidden. In the international space, very often people are placed into those retail share classes with the high fees, and those fees are not transparent, it's not clear, and yet it hampers people's investments massively. So yeah, immediately after the changeover, people were starting to be forced to move into the clean funds, and the culture has followed that. By putting the appropriate regulation in place, the culture around financial advice and financial planning has changed naturally and evolved in the right way with that.
So in the UK, it's heavily regulated. So financial advisors I know they're regulated.
Yeah, massively so.
And planners also?
Yeah, completely correct. So both regulated by the FCA. There is a difference in exactly what actions are regulated. So, for example, if I'm to write a financial plan for a client and it doesn't have a specific product recommendation, it's not technically regulated. But it wouldn't be a complete plan. It would just be guidance if it didn't have a product recommendation. Right? And so therefore we have to have some type of product recommendation along the way. And under that, it then gets regulated by the FCA. So anybody who's calling themselves a financial planner will be regulated in some capacity. Within the UK, it would be by the FCA.
But internationally, are they still regulated?
Well, they should be, yeah. So, and this is part of the problem. One is regulation. Another one is qualification. So in order to provide the financial products to an end client, the product providers, so the investment companies or the insurance companies, that type of thing, they will generally want to work with somebody who has some type of regulation. Now, why do they really want that? Well, they want that to protect themselves, ultimately. It's the broker, the intermediary, is a shield for that insurance company. So they generally want somebody to be regulated. However, the standards of regulation are different in different jurisdictions. So within the UK, as an example, in order to practice, I need to be deemed a fit and proper person, which is something in of itself. But secondarily, I have to have a minimum qualification standard. I need to be at least a level 4 diploma in financial planning or advice, essentially. I need to have those relevant qualifications. In the international space, that's often not the case. And I frequently come across companies which don't have people qualified up to that standard. I'll avoid naming names because they're particularly litigious, but there are some major international companies whereby their staff are not expected to be up to level 4 qualified. They're only expected to be up to level 3 qualified. for example. And in countries like Vietnam, in particular, which has got even less regulation, it is kind of at the forefront of markets and so on. I can't forget what the name is for it, but essentially it's at the edge, kind of the Wild West in some capacity. So that level of qualification is even less. For that matter, I think I am the only person qualified in Vietnam to actually deal with Americans and American-based assets, which for me was kind of crazy when I found that out. Yeah, exactly. And I'm a Brit. Yeah, exactly. But that, I mean, if somebody knows, or if you know somebody who is qualified, then it'd be great to meet them. But until this point, I haven't met anybody of that level, and there does seem to be a very limited number of others who are even level 4 qualified, which in the UK is like the basic standard, right?
Well, would that include banks? Because banks have also their own products.
Yeah.
Or are they really more like independent financial advisors who aren't independent because they work for a bank?
Yeah, so the regulation within the UK is somewhat split. So you have the Prudential Regulatory Authority, which will deal with large insurers and large banks. And then you'll have the FCA, so Financial Conduct Authority, which will deal with investment managers, which will deal with financial advisors, financial planners, that kind of side of the market. And they also deal with the banks too. So banks get double regulation. In places like Vietnam, you only have regulation really on the banks and the insurance providers, and even then it's more limited, right? Places like the US, the banks are often considered separate from your independent actors, if that makes sense. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. So how did you get started in this industry in the first place?
Yeah. I mean, it helps to be a massive nerd, I think. But really, it comes back to a conversation that I had with my mum when I was 18. Before I get into that, my mum always gave me this amazing passion for stories, right? And this conversation with my mum when I was 18, I'd just come back from living in Zambia, which I moved to when I was 17 because that's what you do when you're 17-year-old me. And I came back to the UK and I was sat with her in the car and she broke down crying. And she said to me, "Robin, you've done so much with your life already. And what have I done? I'm X-old and all these things. What have I done? What have I achieved?" Frankly, I will admit I was slightly insulted by that because I thought, well, you created me and my brother and sister, and all these other things. But really, it was a moment where I knew that I didn't want anyone, if I could help it, to have that same reflection of what have I really done with my life. And so that became a guiding principle in my career of how can I empower and enable as many people as possible to make sure that they are achieving the things that they want to achieve, that they're fulfilling their life's potential. That if they were to die tomorrow, then they wouldn't have missed out on that person that they could have been. So instead, how can we start to achieve that today in many capacities, and how can we leave an ongoing legacy to empower others thereafter? Does that answer the question around that, or do you want me to kind of take you on the journey? Yeah.
As a result of that, it's thought, I know, I'll become an independent financial advisor.
Well, that's part of it, right? So when you have a drive to do something, there's a question of where are your talents, and as I've already seen, I'm a massive nerd and I'm really technical, right? So some of the things which I knew that I was good at and that I had a passion for was around money, around markets, around the planning that needs to go into that. Ultimately, money is a vehicle. It's a tool. Wealth means nothing without a destination, if that kind of makes sense. But it is the very vehicle that we need to use in order to, achieve and accomplish those things within our life. So I knew that it had to be a focal point for me. Going into the industry, I think I probably saw exactly what I didn't want to be. as kind of my first job within this, right? So I was an insurance broker as my first job within the industry. And I left that within 7 months because I just thought, this isn't right. The products that were being sold, the people they were being sold to, I couldn't hack it. And it left a bit of a bad taste in my mouth. But I then got a job which was with a financial planning company, just as an internship, essentially. And I saw the other side. I saw people starting to do the very things which I wanted to do around empowerment and enablement. You know, how do you allow people to not just live their best lives, but, you know, kind of really achieve the things which they should be achieving, right? That then led me on a bit of a journey through the industry. So I was working with pension funds, I was working with family offices, multifamily offices, kind of institutional money. And I got sick of it. I got sick of working within London because I started to realize that what I was doing was not the very reason why I got into the industry. I wasn't ultimately having a positive impact upon people's lives. So I took a step out, ended up while I was kind of traveling around the world, having a layover in Vietnam, and I thought, yeah, I quite like the energy here, you know. And it was energy that was reminiscent to me of Bangkok, you know, 20 years ago, which is when I was there with family, and it was this growth energy, this longing for more, this entrepreneurial spirit. And all the people which I've encountered in Vietnam, whether they be foreigners or whether they be locals, you know, they tend to have the same entrepreneurial spirits. You know, they're all builders, they're all leaders in kind of some capacity, right? Whether they be the English as a second language, you know, tutor, or whether they be the business leaders such as yourself. You know, everybody here is somebody who's kind of at the forefront, and that's exciting. So that gave me an opportunity to take the industry skills I'd learned working with some of the biggest and the most powerful families, you know, within the UK, saying, okay, well, actually, how can we make those same things available to real people, those same techniques, those same you know, plans, you know, that type of stuff. And that's why I'm here today.
So that brought you here.
Yeah.
So what's the favourite thing about what you do?
Stories. So I mentioned stories before, and you know, this is what keeps me kind of engaged. I love seeing, I get a real kick out of seeing people succeed and seeing dreams start to be realized. You know, if I give you a couple of examples, there was an early client of mine who she had not, for whatever reason, perhaps done as much thinking about how things might be, you know, when she was a bit older. And while she had a good income, her retirement plan was essentially jumping off, you know, the cliffs in Ireland. Not necessarily the best retirement plan. But between us, what we were able to do was we were able to work out a plan and a strategy whereby by investing a relatively low amount in comparison to the amount that she was earning, she would be able to retire properly with an income whereby she would never have to worry about money. She would never run out of money. She would be owning her own home, which was something that at the time she didn't think that she would be in a position to be able to do. And she wouldn't have to be jumping off the cliffs in Ireland. No, a really, really good example of that type of thing. But then it also comes through to business leaders, right? And that's why I do most of my work, you know, people who run their own businesses. There's a gentleman who is definitely one of my favorite clients, I will admit, although, of course, I love all of my clients. He is slightly more elderly. He has been phenomenally successful in Vietnam. He has built a business which seems to be known by most people here. And that business is on for sale, right? So he'll be selling that business. But then the question comes, how do you then translate that business success into a retirement income which will never run out? And by the way, he's not the type of guy who will be sat on a beach with a pina colada. If he is sat on a beach with a pina colada, it will also be with a laptop. You know, he is the type of guy who has got 2 brand new companies which he's just started up, you know, a few weeks ago, and he's 80, right? So he's a very exciting individual. But we turned this into an ability to never run out of money, and at the same time to leave a legacy to his kids and his kids' kids, whereby that will fund education for them forever. So it's then creating opportunities for those future generations. Seeing that story, seeing that transformation, seeing that realization of what can be done, that's fantastic. The best part of my job is saying yes. Is saying, yes, you can do that. Yes, you do have the money for that. Or actually, you know, you don't have to work. You know, those types of things.
Okay. So how long have you been here now?
So I'm still a relatively new entrant to Vietnam. So I've been here for a year and a quarter.
Okay,
Slightly more than a year and a quarter.
All right,
yeah.
So You're getting yourself established. Has it been a smooth sailing?
I think it's been mixed. I think mostly it's been positive. But as with any new country, and not just new country, but just new place, especially though as an expat, there is so much to navigate. There's so many new things, no matter where you are. It's if you're going somewhere new with this, which has a whole new legal system, a whole new everything, right? Then that's something to overcome. However, I have found, just as with riding motorbikes in Vietnam, that you kind of do it once, and then suddenly the second time is a lot easier, and before you know it, you're a fish in water, right? There's some excellent people here, and there's some really, really, really good established communities. And so one thing that's been massively useful for me has been able to join those communities. Shout out to Victor Burrell here, by the way. But yeah, so to join those communities and to kind of really get involved with the things which are happening. It's an exciting place.
That's so Victor Business Executive Network.
Yeah, you got it.
All right. So what's some of the biggest obstacles you've faced so far to get established here and to do what you really like doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think from a business perspective, one of the biggest obstacles, and one that I'm on a personal crusade to overcome, has been around that perception that you rightly identified, of alignment with what's come before. What I do is so radically different to what has come before, and yet being able to get past that barrier. Everybody who has LinkedIn has been spammed by 100 different people trying to sell them different financial products, right? Or they've been cold called just as many times, or they've been burned by it before, and that's once burned, twice shy, right? So understandably, people are reticent when it comes to that. One of the things which I think has worked quite well to get around that has just by being quite candid and open about who I am, and by being present and talking to people and not rushing and not pushing and not trying to sell products. So in other words, just doing kind of what I came here to do, right? But it takes time for that to start to break through, given the rightly established wariness, around things. So I think that's probably been the hardest thing for me, has been starting to break through that. I think we are getting there. I think that's really being seen. And there's other areas that we're pushing to try to make things like qualification. I'm very much hoping, I know that others on the British Chamber of Commerce, for example, are with me on this, that we want to see levels of qualification really being higher regarded, or more highly regarded rather, within Vietnamese society and within by the Vietnamese regulators, especially when it comes to things like accountancy, when it comes to things like financial planning, my personal hope with that. And given that Vietnam is on this journey, and no comment on this, but they are on this journey towards being an international financial center, that's what the aspiration is. We're hoping that we'll see this as part of it, because ultimately it is a necessity. Otherwise, we will maintain our status as being a bit of a Wild West,
Okay. So are you seeing any trends in the market here?
In the market here? In terms of what I'm doing, or just in terms of like the wider markets?
Maybe just start off with what you're doing.
Yeah. I think there is, let me take it a step back, kind of post-COVID, a lot of the expatriates across Asia went home. Basically, they went back to home countries. And as a result, a lot of the market shrank, in terms of people that these services are provided to. And I predominantly work with expatriates, it's cultural alignment, all these types of things. But the market shrank. And as a result, a lot of the more predatory firms also shrank. We saw offices being closed across Asia. One of the things which we have seen in recent times is we have seen a return of some of these, the usual suspects. And that to me is reflective of a increasing number of expatriates again, which I view as being a good thing, right? what I'm wary of is, I frequently look or unpick work that's been previously done, products which have been sold to people which are just inappropriate, or they're so highly fee-based or commission-loaded, that type of thing. I frequently have to work through those in order to put clients into better positions. And sometimes they really are nasty situations that they've been put into. I worry about that. At the same time, one of the things which I am feeling very positive about is it does seem that the industry as a whole is increasingly moving towards more fee-based structures. My fear with this is that it seems to be a move towards fee-based structures combined with a very heavy sales mindset. And again, I just don't think that leads to the best client outcomes. So, yeah, I think that the trends are that we're seeing an increase in things here. There is a higher number of qualified advisors, which is good. There's a number of other names which I could mention who are very highly qualified or getting there, right now within the industry, and I feel really good about that. There's a number of people who are on the same kind of anti-traditional kind of mindset as me, and I think that that's excellent too. So the more of that, the better. At the same time, though, there is an increase in the usual suspects again.
Okay. So what's a piece of advice you give to someone who, let's say they're an expat in the market here. They've come across all sorts of folks, whatever they call themselves, independent financial advisors usually. Financial planner's the newer one. But as you say, people don't necessarily understand the difference. So
and understandably so, right?
They're all the same. They might have been burned, they might not have been burned, but what are the red flags that they should look for?
I think there's two really clear and obvious ones. The first one is just about how people get remunerated. So a lot of the products that, in fact, let's take a step back even further from that. What are the questions that they're asking you? Are they talking about you, your hopes, your dreams, your family? Are they preying upon that, or are they having open questions about this? Are they really trying to understand you as an individual? Is it a rushed process, or is it something that takes time and takes reflection? If it is a rushed process, if they're looking for one hook and then driving in on that hook, then they're not considering you holistically. And they need to think about you, your family, not just your hopes and dreams, but, okay, what about your kids' hopes and dreams? Those types of things. How is that being considered on a proper holistic basis? That's the first one. Are they doing that? The second one is around remuneration. So a lot of the products, they pay heavy front-loaded commissions. So what that means is that the salesperson is able to sell a product to the customer, and I use customer rather than client here, because generally there isn't a proper ongoing relationship. You're lucky if you'll see them once a year, that type of thing, right? So they'll start it to the customer, and then they take a step back, and they're not really interested after the kind of first year or two establishment period that keeps people locked into these products. So it's worthwhile checking about how people are remunerated. If there is a proper fee, which is applied every single year and so on, then there's an incentive there. It should be a mutually beneficial relationship. That's what it should be. It should be that you're benefiting from working with them and they're benefiting from serving you, right? And then the final one is around, okay, so what's the actual contractual agreement here? Are they setting up as a proper fiduciary advisor? Are they contractually obliged to be acting in your best interests? If not, why not? Because maybe I'm pessimistic about people, but I do tend to think that unless people are bound into doing these things, there is a natural tendency to think about themselves, as opposed to their clients. And I think that's a big negative to be avoided. I could rattle off a whole bunch of different things around qualification and all this type of stuff, but ultimately it's the first one which I think is the most important. Are they taking the time to really think and consider about you and your family and not just finding one thing to hook onto and use that as a kind of sales lever, if that makes sense.
Now, you mentioned multiple times fiduciary. Do you want to explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. So it's one of those terms which is so kind of common within my industry and within law, but understandably it's not part of the vernacular for most people. A fiduciary is somebody who is legally and morally obliged to be acting in your interest first. So, for example, with my business, what we do is we have a contract with the client, which lays out in the contract that we have to be acting in an interest whereby we put them first. And if they suffer any damages as a result of us not doing that, then they take us to court and can get that money back, quite rightly. So a fiduciary is somebody who is obliged, they have to, put your interest first, not their own.
Is this something you've brought across from the UK?
It's something that, you're correct, came with me from the UK. But it's an interesting one. When I interact with other advisors, particularly those in the UK or the US, it's a given. It's a given that you're a fiduciary. Because quite rightly so, like you are held to be that way by the regulator and by the law. Out here, advisors or salespeople or planners or whatever, they're not obliged to in the same way. And that's not just a Vietnam thing, that's a rest of the world thing. That's a major issue.
So is that a red flag as well, if they're not a fiduciary?
Well, for me, yeah, it would be. I mean, if you're not a fiduciary, then how do I know that you're going to be acting in my best interest? Because taking that negative and pessimistic view of humanity, I kind of think it's more likely that you'll be, operating in your own when push comes to shove.
Okay. All right. So I've sort of asked this question before, but I'm going to ask it in a slightly different way. What makes you feel inspired to be your best self?
To be my best self? I think it's about client outcomes for me. That's part of it. So I kind of base everything I do around the idea of delivering massive value, but really it's about delivering massive results. And the results are better lives for clients. And when I see them succeeding that, or going away from meetings with plans and with hope and with the ability to turn these things into reality, that inspires me to do more, to work harder, to be better. And when I compare myself to other peers within the industry on an international level, I think it's the same thing there. When I see that good work being done, and there is plenty of good work being done out there, then again that gives me that level of inspiration. Maybe it's it sounds like a gimmicky thing to say, but it is true. And for somebody who runs, and you'll understand this as a business owner yourself, your business in many ways almost becomes a bit of an extension of you. So much of your own personality is invested into it. So, well, yes, it is an answer that relates to my business. My business in many ways is a reflection of me, and me of my business, right? So they come together.
Okay. What does success mean to you?
So one of the things which was really important for me when I took a move away from corporate life within London was this idea of making work optional. So for me, success is about freedom. Freedom for me, freedom for my clients, freedom for those that I care about. It's the ability of them to do the things that matter to them, to not be tied into a 9 to 5 for all eternity, and if they stop working, then everything collapses. This doesn't have to mean kind of the financial freedom in the sense of like you can do literally nothing but live off interest forever, although that's great. It's really about freedom to follow purpose, to find purpose and to follow purpose. And for many people, if not most people, that's not necessarily the purpose that they have in the boardroom or at work or whatever the case is. So for me, it's about freedom.
Have you found your purpose?
I think in many ways I have. I think purpose develops over time, but I feel like what I'm doing at the moment is very much in line with purpose and also my own personal morality. as well. My purpose is making a difference, and it's making a difference to allow people to live the lives which they want to live, and at the same time living that same life myself by having that freedom. Is there more that I want to do? Hell yeah, there's more that I want to do. The plans are multiplicitous and never ending, but it's all aligned with that same purpose. It's just about how do we do that and how big can we make it.
And when did you stumble upon your purpose?
Well, as I say, I think the initial moment was that conversation that I had with my mum. But I don't think I was living my life in accordance with that for quite some time. It was something that stayed there as a within my mind, without a shadow of doubt. But I think over time it's been something that I've grown into. All of us have these events within our lives which sometimes knock us back a bit, that sometimes propel us forward. Sometimes it's small and innocuous things that seem to do that, and then when we look back, we think, oh yeah, But as I say, I think the older I get, the more that purpose is manifesting, and every step I take is another step towards furthering that purpose, both in terms of my own freedom and the freedom of clients, of those that I care about.
Okay. Have you had a mentor?
I think I've had mentors throughout my life. I don't think they've been necessarily official mentors, but certainly there have been people who have taken that role and have really, really helped me, and sometimes told me what I needed to hear. Maybe not what I wanted to hear. When I look back into the UK, there's definitely a couple of people which jump out to me. Certainly from when I was working within UK pensions, that I learned a lot from, and that allowed me to develop some of my skills, which I think have carried me in the right way, actually, throughout my life. People who I'm a very creative problem solver. And these were people who saw that creative problem solving, that love for complex problems, and then turning them into quite simple solutions, that type of thing, and really encouraged and empowered me there. That's been important. And as I say, I think the other part is those people who have maybe told me the things that I needed to hear, not what I wanted to hear.
What do people misunderstand about you the most?
I think there's a couple of different things with that. The obvious one is the professional thing. We've touched upon that, right? But there's also the personal, isn't there? I think sometimes I can be quite hard to approach. And while I do my best to reverse that, I know that I have... I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say this, but the kind of the classic resting bitch face, as it were, and that certainly that can have a negative impact. I think that's a big part of it, and also I am somebody who just genuinely cares, and that's in multiple different ways. It can be such small things as just making sure I'm holding the door open for people, but that is something which is a large and quite muscular man, especially when I'm out of my suit, it has a bit of a different impression, right? So I think that's something that people don't get, that actually there's a kindness there and there's a softness, and that's not necessarily seen as opposed to the harder sides of me,
So what do you think's causing that?
The difficulty to see it.
Yeah.
I think part of it's possibly about how I present myself. Part of it's about I'm quite driven in terms of what I want to do and what I want to achieve. I've got quite high standards, especially around work. Poor V, bless her, who's kind of my kind of primary assistant in basically everything. I think she is sometimes on the receiving end of my frustration with getting things done. Although she's very, very good at dealing with that. But that same frustration can then apply in other places. As I say, I have high standards for me, for my clients, for those that I care about. And that's just throughout life. And that can create quite a prickly front sometimes.
Oh, so you're one of those hot-tempered expats, are you?
I'm not sure if I call myself hot-tempered, but I do have high standards. And while I accept the way that things are in Vietnam, that's not necessarily what I'm talking about with this. Even by different cultural standards or different setups and so on and so forth, and I'm entirely accepting of those, there's still just there's kind of a common decency or a laziness which I can't stand when it's especially when it's professional.
Do you think sort of standards are slipping
in life in general?
In general, because I mean they're these little things that obviously irk you. So are you seeing them more frequently?
I'm not sure if I'm necessarily seeing them more frequently because they are more frequent. I think I'm seeing them more frequently because I'm maybe with time more able to know where to look. To give you an example of that, GPT is great for this, right? So ChatGPT. I have received multiple emails where people have on the bottom of the email, would you like me to create blah, 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 thing from ChatGPT because they've copy and pasted the email. That for me is, kind of an example of this, right? And while I encourage the use of AI tools a lot, it is one of those things of, okay, fine, we can do that, but we can have the care, we can ask the questions. And so often things are taken for granted without asking the proper questions around that. Maybe to bring this back to kind of financial planning, it's one of those things where I can ask GPT questions about tax, about planning, and so on and so forth, and it will give me an answer. But as a qualified professional myself, when I look at that, I'm like, okay, A, that calculation is just completely wrong, or B, you haven't considered X, Y, and Z and all the other stuff. And it scares me and worries me, the idea of people having this slippage, being slightly lazy here and taking this, whatever's put out as being for granted. And it's not, and it can't be.
So are you sensing that there might be a slip in standards?
I think so. I think that's part of it. I think that I can't remember what the term is, but the Japanese have this system of operating where, and actually this was very similar in Europe in antiquity and so on, but or even kind of post-antiquity, even the medieval period. This real drive to just be the singularly best at the thing that you do. Whether it be making shoes or sushi or as a financial planner or, whatever the case is, but this real kind of purpose-driven embracing of one's profession or whatever the case is. And perhaps within the modern world, where people are more able to move between things, we don't then have that same level of expertise, that same level of care. And so we do start to see a bit of slippage there, and I know I'm guilty of that sometimes as well, right? So,
okay, let's switch tact a little bit. And do you have any hobbies at all?
I love lifting weights. I spend far too much time in the gym. But outside of that, for me, it's travel and it's story related. My family has a bookshop in the south of France, as an example, and that should be an indicator around my love for stories. So for me, being able to escape there to this beautiful kind of medieval city, large village, in the south of France, to drink my wine, eat my cheese, and read my book on the rooftop. Well, that doesn't sound too bad, But outside of that, it's other types of travel, and I am an aggressive story discoverer, perhaps is a bit of a term for that. So yes, seeing, sampling, trying new things. That, and then it's about self-improvement, right? So the gym, learning, that type of stuff. So
if it's travel, what's the best trip you've ever had?
The best trip I've ever had? I've had so many.
The most memorable then?
I think one of the most memorable moments for me. And I'm not sure if I can say that one trip is the most memorable, because, there are so many, and they're often so different that I couldn't kind of pit them against each other. But one of the most memorable was a trip through Morocco, and I found myself sleeping under the stars in the Sahara Desert. And fortunately, there wasn't a high wind that night. And of course, there's no cloud cover in the Sahara. There's that term, a blanket of stars. And it was something which I kind of took as a given, but never really understood until that moment, where there was no light pollution at all. And the stars felt so close that I could reach out and pluck them and wrap them around me, like some kind of star-laden duvet, basically. I think that's a moment which will stick with me forever. But this September, I do have a trip planned. I'm going to drive from one side of Morocco Mongolia, from one side of Mongolia to the other side of Mongolia on a 50cc motorbike made for children, basically, which has about enough space on it to have a wallet and a toothbrush. And there is no route planned, essentially, just from one side to the other. And we'll see what happens.
And what triggered you to pick Mongolia to do that?
Well, it's one of those kind of maybe last few wildernesses in many ways. The world does still have them. They're just harder to find. But Mongolia is one which is definitely there. And again, maybe this comes back to freedom, that type of thing. When I go places, I try to go places which are slightly less trodden. Even if I go to places which are often trodden. Wadi Rum, for example, in Jordan would be a great example. Fine, I'll go, but I'll go at the low season when it's incredibly hot, because that way I can make sure that as much of it is I'm able to experience the place more than the legions of other tourists. And certainly, within Mongolia, this is another place where I feel that I can do that.
What's the best compliment you've ever received?
The best compliment?
Yeah.
I don't think I store them, but I think probably the biggest compliments, the ones that I carry with me, are ones around making a difference, making an impact. Some of these are obviously related to work, but some of them are in other places too. I've done charity work for a lot of my life. When I moved to Zambia, one of the things which I did then was get involved in a local charity in terms of helping people there. And all of the major compliments that matter to me are ones around making a difference. Don't get me wrong. I like a compliment about myself just as much as anybody else, right? But there really is something there around making a bigger impact, a bigger difference, changing lives, essentially.
That sort of touches on another question I want to ask you. Would you like to share some of your values?
My values?
Yeah.
I think honesty is a really, really big one. Honesty, fidelity, so kind of trustworthiness and so on around that, and dedication to a cause. And a job well done, actually. So kind of taking the time to do things properly. I think those are three things which are there. And then, of course, there is the overriding thing which I mentioned earlier, which is around freedom. And having the freedom to do those things, right? And to operate within that framework. There was an interesting conversation I had with a friend of mine who, and he's a financial planner as well, actually. And he was talking about a fence, the idea that sometimes the fence gives freedom, so sometimes by establishing boundaries, you have more freedom than if you don't establish the boundaries. And I think that while freedom is kind of like that overarching value, at the same time, perhaps that honesty, that fidelity, those types of things, those are the things which give me the fence to, be more free than I would be without them.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, you do need boundaries.
Yeah.
Okay, because if you don't have boundaries, then people will cross them.
Quite. Or you cross them.
Or you cross them, yeah.
Yeah.
And it also potentially makes your values a bit wishy-washy.
Yeah.
All right. What makes you smile?
What makes me smile?
Yeah. Apart from that question.
Yeah. I think when things are fun, when something causes me to think or to explore a topic, a concept, that type of stuff, that makes me smile. And seeing the happiness of loved ones, that makes me smile too. So, and just people that I care about, that's very important. That and wonder makes me smile. When I see something which just blows my mind, I'm grinning from ear to ear, and there's a high that comes with that, right?
Not the blanket of stars.
Yeah, exactly. And I will never get over that.
Well, you're going to Mongolia.
Well, I'm hoping I'll see it again there. Yeah, exactly.
See something else there, that's for sure. If you could be remembered for one thing, what would it be?
It's a very, very good question. I think perhaps this then comes back to my values, and maybe part of what I'd said within my values could actually be summed up by another word. So things like fidelity, things like honesty. For me, they're part of honor as a concept, which I think is something that is often misplaced or mislabeled, within the world that we live today. And the thing that jumped to mind when you said about what would I want to be remembered for, that was doing the right thing. But really, that comes into the same thing, and that's a matter of honor, right? So it's ruled by that same kind of overarching principle. And I know it's old-fashioned, but I don't think it needs to be. I think that there are so many elements of that which are just as pertinent, if not more, today than perhaps before. I think that's probably the biggest one.
Okay, so on the flip side of that, what's your biggest pet peeve?
My biggest pet peeve. All right.
Just one.
Yes, I have many. I think possibly my biggest pet peeve is people not caring. Not thinking about others and the impact that they have by doing or not doing something. That's my biggest pet peeve, and that it all ties together, right? So I spoke about my frustrations when it comes to my kind of standards, as it were. And so when people don't care, they often then fall short of the standards that they set themselves, or that are set by other people, or that are just expected by society. When people don't care, but bad stuff happens. So that we need to be able to think about others, within that. And sometimes that means doing the right thing, not the easy thing. And putting yourself in other people's shoes.
So is it really about not caring, or is it about they're crossing your boundaries of honesty, fidelity, honor?
Well, I think they come together, do they not? I think that when one does care, then they are in line with those things which I outlined around my boundaries. When one doesn't, then they naturally cross it. But it's not about caring about my values, right? It's about caring about other people on a wider basis. I think if you do that, then you start to more naturally follow those boundaries.
What are you most curious about right now?
Right now?
Well, not right now, this second.
Yeah.
Well, it could be that as well.
I think the thing which I'm most curious about at the moment is it's actually something that I've been working on with a couple of other people. And this is going to be quite nerdy, so sorry, but Vietnam and Asia find themselves in an interesting position. And Vietnam in particular has a very young economy. Arguably its economy is 50, 30 years old, really. And so what we have families whereby your kind of more senior generation have been fantastic wealth creators, many of them. And your rising generation who come thereafter often they find themselves lacking in purpose in some ways. We have family conflict, this type of thing. And so the thing that's been fascinating me as a financial planner has been that the biggest impact upon family wealth is not a dodgy investment, not taking out an insurance policy, but actually it's about family interaction. It's about how do you get these families to talk to each other? How do you do the succession planning around this? How is the senior generation, the elder generation, able to talk to the rising generation and empower the rising generation while at the same time feeling a sense of security that the rising generation aren't just going to destroy everything? These are really important and tough questions, and often this rising generation, and they don't have to be kids in their teens or 20s, they could be in their 30s, 40s, 50s. Often they are afflicted by that lack of purpose in ways that negatively impact health. These can be things whereby there are problems with addiction. For example, there are problems with just even phone addiction. That type of thing, right? There are problems with the general issues that come with having a lack of purpose. Are they out having fun the whole time, or starting 1,000,001 different little projects that never really go anywhere because they're lacking true purpose in what they do? And so for me, it's been really fascinating to look at how those family dynamics actually have to play into an overarching plan around family wealth. What are the biggest killers of family wealth? Okay, well, it's unprepared heirs, it's divorce, it's sudden death. That type of thing, right? So how do I then, as a financial planner, start to keep that in mind and start to build up something which is able to, help the people that I work with, the families that I work with, also deal with those tough things, which I think traditionally were perhaps more the realm of a coach or a psychologist, but actually they're just as important in the financial realm.
Interesting comment. I mean, I remember earlier you said when you were back in the UK, you were working for single family and multifamily office.
Yep.
That concept is pretty well established in the UK.
Yes.
How does that compare to here?
Well, it's just not established at all. So by the concept, sorry, do you mean the family office concept?
Family office concept.
Yeah, so I think an increasing number of families are starting to look towards places like Singapore as places to set up a family office or to join a multi-family office. What I've noticed is, and just for kind of clarity, the work that I did with them was around asset custody. So in other words, where do you place your assets to keep them safe? That type of thing. Out here, the focus around family wealth is around the financial capital. There is not a focus on the human capital in the same way. Or if there is a focus, it's a parental concern about a child as opposed to a consideration of almost like from an HR perspective, right? Because your family has human capital. It has social capital. What about the philanthropic side of things? Because again, that generates purpose. It has a positive impact. As wealthy people, you are a custodian yourself, a steward of that wealth and of the family as much as anything else. And there are responsibilities that come with that. Out here, we only really, from what I've seen, some exceptions, of course, have a focus upon the financial. I've repeatedly seen papers released from places like Hong Kong or Singapore, which talk only about the numbers, and they're not focusing upon, the capital that actually matters more, which is that family human capital.
Okay. Now, what's the most unusual experience you've had in business so far?
I'm glad that you added the caveat to that. The most unusual experience in business so far. It's a really difficult question, actually. And I think part of this is because things kind of become... I take a lot of things in stride. And so I'm not particularly concerned around that. I think it's been a weird one for me, in some senses coming to Asia, in that sometimes the way that business is transacted is in places that I would not usually visit, and so being kind of dropped into that has been a bit of a, what's going on here? but ultimately, it actually comes back down to the same things. It's about trust, right? And I think that I probably had weirder conversations in more standard environments, which were possibly less kind of immediately shocking. I'm afraid I don't have a good answer to your question, in part because for me, kind of the weird is just kind of normal. Because we're dealing with humans, right? And with humans, there's always something weird. If it was on a business-to-business level, then I'm sure that there'd be more standout stuff. But as it is, I deal with individuals. And every individual has their own quirks. And some of the things I hear are wild, but they're not the type of thing which I would ever repeat, of course.
You can't. All right, so let's talk about the most unusual experience you've ever had not in business, just in life.
That's you can't ask me that one because it's so... I've had a lot of interesting experiences.
Just pick one.
No, I've had a lot of interesting experiences.
Prepared to be shocked.
No, I think the more interesting, I mean, I gave you the example of kind of sleeping beneath the stars in the Sahara and that type of thing. And I think all of my PG experiences are ones which kind of follow a similar vein. They are ones which are incredible, beautiful places, or things which just perhaps you wouldn't necessarily realize the majesty until you are there. You might know that it's majestic, but my God, you don't really understand until you're there, A couple of years ago for my birthday, I went up and down Mount Olympus, in one day rather than the two that's recommended. When I was coming back down, because it was so quick, the oxygen change hits you, and I felt high as a kite and started running down the mountain, which was not a very clever thing to do, given the way that the paths are. If I'd have stumbled, then that could well have been it. But it's things like that, which I think for me are maybe the experiences that I hold on to. In terms of other more unusual things, well, those are things which are maybe better discussed over a beer.
Okay. So what do you think the world's going to look like in, say, 5 years? What are your thoughts?
I've got mixed feelings about this. So, and I kind of had this internal battle between optimism and pessimism, right? I think I naturally err on the side of optimism because I think that where there is chaos, there is opportunity. And we see so much change right now. It's wild. And it's interesting to consider that from an investment perspective as well, AI is a clear thing that everybody's talking about, but even if we ignore AI, the shifts in global power, the shifts in allegiances, the way that contracts are falling to businesses as a result of this, already. Certainly, what's happening within the US, that's changed the way that every other country will now be regarding and interacting with the US, and speaking as a non, US person, that is both to the benefit and the detriment of both the US and every other country that has some kind of a relationship with them. So the whole global landscape is changing. Whether or not that's going to be for the better or worse, I don't know. I worry about Taiwan. I worry about Ukraine. I worry about the impact on commodity prices. But again, all these things lead to opportunity. I think that both in terms of investment opportunity, right? But also in terms of places like Vietnam, which sits in this, kind of the fantastic Southeast Asian politics of fence sitting, essentially playing both sides, and it stands in a position to be able to benefit immensely, from things like this going on, while at the same time it might still be hit with the general brush at every other country as by the US. But it's a time of change. So for me, I'm optimistic because I think there's new opportunity. But fundamentally, I think that this means that we need to have a different focus upon what we do as businesses, from what we do as humans, and to reconsider where our real value is. Certainly within my industry as an example, I honestly don't think that the real value comes from stock picking or fund picking or whatever the case is. The real value comes from where's the human in this? Where's the life story in this? How can I make a difference and allow that person to be, to fulfill their potential, as opposed to how can I pick the next NVIDIA, or whatever, right? I mean, don't get me wrong, if I could do that, that'd be great, but there's enough kind of algorithmic abilities in trading to be able to do that my skills as an analyst are, neither here nor there, really.
Okay. If you could remove all barriers and all constraints, what project would you do? And would you want to be known only by that project?
That's a very, very big question.
I know.
It's a very big question. I think I don't want to get too big on this, because otherwise we could be here all day with how sprawling my project would become. But if I could think on a smaller level, so I'm going to avoid my natural kind of big thinking side of things, because as I say, we will be here all day. I think one of the big ones is increasing the level of financial education. I think that's something which is really needed. I came from the UK education system. I assume you did too. And within that, there is no proper financial education. There's no education about tax, for God's sake. What's going on with that? And why can't that level of financial education, that money mindset training, why can't that be rolled out to across the world to various different sectors of society and different people? There's some fantastic work which I'm hoping to see come into fruition this year. I'm not going to jinx it by talking about it, but there's a couple of different things that I'm working on with a number of different people and organizations, in order to start to promote that financial education. And it's at all levels. We're not just talking about school kids, we're talking about adults, we're talking about business leaders, we're talking about families, right? So for me, I think doing something there is very, very important, because again, that comes back to enabling more people to live the life that they should be living.
Okay. Now, how can our listeners find you online if they wanted to find you?
Yeah, sure. So I think the easiest place to find me would be LinkedIn. Okay. So Robin Copley, on LinkedIn. So I think I'm literally linkedin.com/Robin Copley. Okay. We also have a website which you can find me on as well. So there's a couple of different websites. So you can find me on wealtharchitects.global, which is my kind of fiduciary services firm based out of the UK. And you can also find me on the Infinity Solutions website as well. Okay. So those would be the places to find me.
We'll put all the details in the show notes, so don't worry. Now, in closing, what's one question that you wished that I'd asked you, but I haven't?
It's a very, very good question.
And whatever it was, how would you answer it?
I think maybe a question which would have been worthwhile asking is, and part of what we're doing is we're looking at how's the world changing, and what does the new normal look like, or the new abnormal look like, right? And so I think what would have been a good question to ask would have been around what's the most important thing for us to consider and to framework in which to operate, within this new abnormal. And I think that compassion is perhaps, the answer to that. Compassion and attempting to understand each other. And this comes through in so many different ways. It's a clear core part of what I do, right? But it's the same with coaching, as an example. There has to be compassion for you and the client, but also teaching that level of compassion and understanding to others when it comes to, coaching of them. Business coaching is part of this. And even sales training, comes into this, right? But compassion is something which which is so important. And the more that things like AI are able to take on, other parts of what we do, some well, some not so well. At the same time, that level of compassion, I think, is essential for us to remain competitive in comparison to AI, as well as just to have a positive impact on the world.
Okay. So thank you very much for that. And on that note, we've come to the end of our show. So I'd really like to thank you very much, Robin, for joining us today. And to all our listeners, we'll put all of Robin's contacts in the show notes. So don't worry and look out for those. And see you next time. Thanks a lot, Robin.
Thank you very much, Rick. It's been a pleasure.